Trigger warning. This video discusses sexual violence, assault, and trauma. If that may be distressing, please take care of yourself before continuing. The Colosseum from a distance is an empire's triumph. Arches bleeding sunlight onto clean sand, stone tiers humming with the memory of applause. But beneath that sunlit arena, in the damp corridors and narrow cells, the world looks different. The metallic tang of blood and iron, the close, stale air of subterranean rooms, the muffled sobs of those who will never step back into daylight. What we celebrate as a spectacle of courage and skill also hid systems designed to commodify bodies and normalize cruelty. What gladiators did to their captives, and what Roman society allowed them to do, is a story that complicates the hero myth and forces us to face a less comfortable truth about ancient Rome. Histories of gladiators often fix on valor and tragic fate. Men who fought for freedom, glory, or simply survival. But when we follow the paper trail, the bone evidence, and the private notes of people who lived those moments, another figure emerges alongside the gladiator, the captured woman who passed through the same institutions, treated not as a protected civilian, but as an object within an economy of entertainment and domination. A lanista's ledger, skeletal remains recovered beneath arena structures, a wax tablet scribbled by an anxious fighter, medical notes, and imperial anecdotes together reveal a pattern, not of isolated horror, but of routinized dehumanization. If you want more investigations into history's silent stories, subscribe and like this video. It helps keep this work alive. Administrative records are usually dull. That is precisely why they can be the most revealing. Among the surviving documents attributed to the administrative networks that supplied the gladiatorial world is a ledger kept by a lanista, the owner and manager of a ludus, often dated to around 62 CE. Its language is transactional, terse, and chilling in its normalcy. Entries list animals, equipment, and, alongside these, human captives recorded with the same accounting tone, numbers, origin markers, and simple labels. One line, translated in scholarship and discussed by modern historians, records purchases described as 12 barbarian females bought at a discount. The ledger treats these women as part of the ludus's inventory, items to be used, exchanged, or disposed of according to spectacle and profit. We should be precise about what that document shows and what it does not. The ledger is not a legal code ordering specific acts. It is bookkeeping. Evidence that women were purchased, counted, and entered into the commodified world of gladiatorial supplies. It offers a window into an economy that made human beings into stock. Scholars debate the full range of uses these institutional records imply, but the ledger's transactional language cuts through idealizing myths. It forces us to ask, if captured women appear in the same accounts as whips, ropes, and beasts, how were they treated when the crowd called for display? Written records alone are not enough. Archaeology presses the story into 3 dimensions. In 2018, osteological analysis published by teams working on remains found in subterranean cells beneath arena complexes brought new, uncomfortable evidence into the light. The bones, several young female skeletons recovered from confinement spaces that seem to have functioned as holding areas or service rooms beneath an arena, display patterns of healed and unhealed trauma inconsistent with simple neglect. Multiple peri-mortem and ante-mortem indicators suggest repeated blunt force injuries and stress markers on bones that are often associated with repeated physical coercion and severe living conditions. The morphology of some fractures and the distribution of stress markers raise questions that cannot be explained by ordinary domestic accidents. As with any archaeological claim, caveats are essential. The sample size is limited. Stratigraphic context has been disturbed in places, and interpreting trauma on bones always requires caution. Some scholars argue that burial practices, post-depositional damage, or frequent handling could account for parts of the assemblage's condition. Yet when osteological data is read alongside documentary traces, the ledger's entries, references in contemporary literature, and the physical layout of these subterranean spaces beneath arenas, the converging evidence suggests that at least some of these women were confined in spaces associated with spectacle and were exposed to repeated violence. Beyond ledgers and bones, we possess fragments of voice from the people who inhabited this world. A wax tablet from Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash and later recovered, contains a short, raw note from a gladiator to his mother. In it, the fighter speaks in a voice suddenly domestic and haunted, explaining how, after victories, men are given the barbarians. He admits the images of those given to them do not leave his mind. That line, stark and unadorned, is not a dramatist's flourish. It is a personal record of how prize and spoils in the gladiatorial economy could include people. The phrase encapsulates a transfer. Victory becomes not only spectacle, but entitlement. It is crucial to treat this testimony with the respect due to a primary source. The wax tablet does not narrate every detail of what followed when captives were allocated. It does not tell us how often such transfers resulted in forced sexual acts, or whether other fates were sometimes possible. Nevertheless, the tablet confirms that gladiators, men who were themselves often enslaved, trained to perform sanctioned violence, were at times recipients of living human spoils. That placement between triumph and private action created opportunities for abuse that documentation and archaeology corroborate elsewhere. Medical literature from the Roman world adds another dimension: the clinical gaze that treated bodies as economic assets or liabilities. Galen, the physician whose case notes and treatises became central to later medical thought, wrote about gladiators, wounds, and the logistics of care. In some of his clinical observations and routine discussions of care for those who labored in arenas, Galen's language at times quantifies value and loss. The health of a fighting man could mean the difference between profit and expense for a lanista or owner. When Galen describes the treatment of prisoners or those kept for public displays, his focus is often on utility and prognosis rather than on moral injury. That clinical indifference, the language that slips from healing to calculation, is itself telling. It demonstrates how an institutional culture could reduce living people to units of economic consideration. Literary testimony gives us the theatrical high point and the worst of it. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century CE, recounts scenes from Nero's rule that many historians have long scrutinized. He describes occasions in which the emperor orchestrated elaborate performances that blurred staged rescue with sexual spectacle. In Suetonius's account, what begins as theatrical rescue by a supposed hero could degenerate into public sexual humiliation and assault in front of tens of thousands. Modern scholars debate the rhetorical aims of Suetonius. He had motives and moral distances of his own, and historians caution against taking every imperial anecdote at face value. Yet Suetonius's testimony, read alongside administrative and archaeological records, is consistent with a culture capable of turning private violation into public entertainment, and it demonstrates that elite-driven spectacle sometimes included sexualized displays. Across different kinds of evidence, the pattern is disturbingly consistent. The institutions that produced gladiatorial games, lanistae, ludus managers, the spectacle economy, and the spectators, created pathways by which captured women could be displayed, humiliated, and violated. But we must resist a simple binary of victims and villains. The gladiator himself sits in a morally ambiguous position. He could be an enslaved man who fights for survival, a trained instrument of state violence, sometimes a celebrity, and occasionally an agent who committed abuses against captives. That complexity matters because it illuminates how systems coerce individuals into actions that they might not otherwise choose. There are recorded moments of refusal that complicate any narrative of universal complicity. Consider the episode preserved by some ancient sources of Nicomedes, a gladiator who, according to the evidence, chose corporal punishment rather than accept a captive woman as his reward. He preferred lashes to the social and moral cost of taking what was offered. Some accounts stress the personal honor that led to this choice. Others interpret it as an act of fear, a pragmatic decision to avoid scandal or disease. Either way, the episode demonstrates that within an institutional frame designed to elide consent, individual agency sometimes asserted itself, and that such refusal carried consequences. Not all gladiators embraced every practice expected of them. Not every choice was free, but some people resisted. Graffiti scratched into stone at gladiatorial schools and amphitheaters give us another human trace: the half-joked, half-bitter remarks of people living that life. In Capua and other training centers, inscriptions range from boastful names and erotic jokes to bitter comments about fate, defeat, and private misery. Public inscriptions can be slippery evidence; they are performative. But when read in the aggregate, they reveal a culture that celebrated triumph while tolerating humiliation, that normalized crude talk about spoils and prizes, and that allowed contempt for outsiders to be written casually in stone. Graffiti is the voice of ordinary actors in an extraordinary system. It shows the crowd's complicity not just as abstract moral failing, but as everyday practice, jokes, bets, and wagers that made violence ordinary. At this point, the question becomes systemic. How did a society built on legal codes, civic rituals, and familial piety permit such normalized brutality? The answer lies in the mechanics of spectacle, economy, and ideology. Gladiatorial games were not accidental violence; they were institutional performances deeply embedded in Roman social life. They required logistics. Captives captured in war or raids, managers to buy and sell, medical staff to keep fighters alive, and crowds willing to consent to cruelty. Each link in that chain had material incentives: profit for the lanista, status for the sponsor, entertainment for the citizenry. The crowd's applause and the elite's patronage were not peripheral, but essential. Spectacle turned suffering into currency, and currency made practices repeatable and ordinary. Dehumanization, in this frame, functions as both means and end. To stage public violence, participants need to suspend the moral rules that bind ordinary relations. Labels like barbarian, female captives, or prize were rhetorical devices that made this suspension possible. Naming a person as other, as enemy, as property, as spectacle, lowers the barrier to treating them as disposable. The institutional architecture reinforced these rhetorical moves. Legal categories allowed ownership, economic systems incentivized display, and theatrical conventions turned private pain into public delight. The result was a culture in which cruelty became normalized, not despite social norms of civility, but in part because spectacle rewired what counted as acceptable public behavior. When we study these mechanisms, a disturbing contemporaneity appears. Modern societies do not replicate ancient Roman practices in form, but they share recurrent patterns in how groups justify or facilitate violence. Dehumanizing language, economic incentives tied to spectacle, and the role of mass audiences in legitimating cruelty are recurring themes across time. Propaganda that labels a group as subhuman, media spectacles that turn suffering into entertainment, and economic systems that objectify bodies all resemble the machinery that made ancient spectacles possible. These are parallels in mechanism, not moral equivalents. The past does not map neatly onto the present, but it does provide a lens to examine how ordinary people become complicit in institutionalized harm. That realization returns us to the moral responsibility of spectators, ancient and modern. The faces in the amphitheater were not a special breed of monsters. They were neighbors, political actors, and citizens. They laughed, voted, and dined. Their participation normalized cruelty. Remembering the captured women, and the many who remain unnamed in our records, is therefore not an exercise in ancient guilt alone. It is an ethical task for our era, to name the forgotten, to measure how modern institutions may similarly manufacture consent for harm, and to resist the rhetorical moves that make others disposable. What, then, can we do with this knowledge? First, we can acknowledge the limits of our sources while refusing to let uncertainty become a shelter for silence, where ledgers, bones, tablets, medical notes, and literary accounts converge. They create a serious case for systemic abuse. Second, we can elevate victims' dignity in our retelling by using neutral, humanizing terms and by refusing gratuitous detail that would re-expose trauma. Third, the historian's duty is not merely to catalogue cruelty, but to analyze the structures that produced it: economic incentives, institutional roles, and the performative logic of spectacle. Finally, witnessing matters. To remember the captives, to put back into the center of the story those marginalized by archival practices, is a small corrective to centuries of erasure. It is also a warning. When entertainment and economics intersect with a language of othering, even ordinary people can be drawn into practices that debase and harm. Recognizing that dynamic in Rome helps us recognize it in the present. If you want to read further, the video description includes links to primary sources and accessible scholarship that inform this investigation, including essays and books by prominent historians who have grappled with gladiatorial culture. For a thoughtful analytic voice on Roman spectacle and social life, see Mary Beard's work. For archaeological and osteological reports, check the cited 2018 study and associated excavation notes. Primary sources such as translations of Galen and Suetonius are also available for those who want to engage directly with the ancient texts. We close, then, not with spectacle, but with a quiet image. Empty corridors beneath the arena, footprints in dust, an oxidized shackle left where it fell. These mute traces are the counter-monuments to public applause. They remind us that heroism and horror were interwoven in Rome's arenas, that perpetrators and victims often occupied neighboring roles, and that systems can make everyday cruelty seem acceptable. Remembering the captured women rebalances a story that, for too long, has centered only applause and gladiatorial glory. If this account moved you, please share it with others, subscribe, and check the description for further reading and primary sources. Engaging with the past honestly helps us see the patterns that can still trap us today.